All right, so on to the 70s, the groovy 70s. So, you guys are going to answer the question of what it was like to be a woman in the 1970s. So, you're going to find that out on your own under these categories. You've done it for the 50s and the 60s. We sort of did it together. This time you're on your own. So, have at it, and I'll see you on the next slide. Now, there are some things that I am going to help you with as far as the women in the 1970s, and one of them is the changes in reproductive rights. This is going to happen under a case that goes by the name Jane Roe versus Henry Wade, or Roe v. Wade. It's most often known as. The girl's name is not really Jane Roe, it was Norma McCorvey, and Wade was the district attorney. This took place in Texas. And Jane Roe, we're going to call her Jane Roe. Jane was only 21 years old. She was pregnant with her third child. She had been kind of tricked into allowing her mother to adopt her first child. Her second child, she willingly put into adoption. And this third one, she just did not want to do it again. She even absolutely tried to say that it was a result of a rape, because she thought that Texas law, and again, this is taking place in Texas, Texas law would allow abortions if it was because of a rape that you got pregnant. Now, that ended up not being true, and she had to admit that she told a lie, but it became very public because she told the lie, and a couple lawyers approached her and said, if you let us, we can take this to court and we can change the reproductive rights of all the women in the United States. And so under the Roe v. Wade case, we for the first time get the idea of viability. Um, where or at what point can a fetus live outside of the mother's body, even if it has to be on life support? And Roe v. Wade ended up coming up with the idea of 23 to 24 weeks. After that, the baby is viable and you can no longer have an abortion. So what the fight was basically based on is the idea of the 14th Amendment and your privacy rights. So, does telling a woman that she cannot have an abortion violate the 14th Amendment? And some of the judges said yes, some said no. I can't remember the exact outcome of this, but I want to say it was 4-7, 5-7. I don't remember how many Supreme Court judges, but it wasn't an all-out win, because some of them really did believe that it did violate the 14th Amendment and others said no. So the lawyers in Roe v. Wade also tried the 13th Amendment, and they likened forcing a woman to have a baby she doesn't want to slavery, that you're enslaving them in the bonds of motherhood. So some of the judges agreed with that, some of them did not. So in the end, they removed the at the federal level, they're saying that states can't outlaw abortion, that you have to go with this viability understanding. After 23 or 24 weeks, no, you can't. The problem is the states didn't listen to it. There are still some states today that never changed what they have on the law books about abortion, and in different states it's different as far as the how many weeks do they consider the baby to be viable. Is the baby viable at 20 weeks? So to ask, is it still that way today? There's no way to really answer that question. It's too tricky. It depends on what state you're in. But I will tell you something very interesting, and you don't have to write this in your notes. I just think it's interesting. Jane Roe, when she became older, she had women, 20 years after this law case happened, coming up to her thanking her for making it so that she could get an abortion, and some of these women had had multiple abortions, and Jane Roe, or Norma, really felt these horrible feelings of guilt. She didn't, I guess, understand exactly what it was going to be like for her when people found out who she was and how she was attached to this case. And so she had started talking, 20 years later, that hey, I'm really Jane Roe, and women thanked her. And when she heard the stories of, like, some of them had 5 and 6 abortions, she felt really super guilty and actually turned the tables on it, and went to court on several different occasions in different cases, saying Roe v. Wade was a bad decision, that abortion should be illegal. So she completely changed the way that she looked at it as she became older. But do know that Roe v. Wade gave women reproductive rights. You could have an abortion up to 23 to 24 weeks at the federal level. And then again, like I said, the states didn't quite follow along with that. All right, so we also have to add Title IX in there for women's rights of the 1970s. 1972, it was added to the Civil Rights Act, and here you see what it says. No person in the U.S. on the basis of sex should be excluded in or denied benefits or subjected to discrimination under educational programs or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So, in other words, girls should get free education when they are deserving of it. So, this is the big deal, though. You're talking mostly about sports, and the impact on those athletic programs is going to be gigantic because it was always the boys who were getting free college for sports, and now you're saying that the girls have to get it too, and it's going to really devastate some of these athletic programs that were male dominated. So look at the changes. In 1972, 7% in law 7% of women were in law, and today it's 44%. 9% were in the medical field, today it's 41%. And there's no doubt at all that these percentages got higher because more women were getting free college, or at least help with college, through athletic programs. So it hurt the males, but it definitely helped the females. And again, Title IX, you can't exclude a woman from an educational program or assistance to get an education like college. All right, so what else did ladies get in the 1970s? We got an ERA amendment, an Equal Rights Amendment, introduced by Alice Paul all the way back in 1923, and it took until 1972 for it to pass Congress. It's very simple. Here it is: equality. Equality. Can I say it again? Equality. That's all it is. So it passes Congress, but then it has to go to the states. It still is not an amendment to this day. We needed 38. And as of a year or so ago, we only had 35. These are the ones that said no to it. Notice, 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 Virginia is one of them. Now, one of these states went ahead and said okay to it last year, and that would be Nevada. So, ladies, we still need two states to give us equality under federal law. Two states. Come on, man. Grow up and do something about that. Come on, ladies, it's all up to you. All right, let's talk about TV of the 70s. TV is where you really see the changes in women and you see what is now socially acceptable. Alice was a big TV show. It was about a waitress who was a widow, so she hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't a divorcee, she was a widow, and she had to take care of her young son. And it's about problems. She's a waitress and she has no man, she has no money, she has a child that she has to raise, she has to be the male figure for her child. And so here's all these situations that American women had been facing, but nobody talked about it until the show Alice. Then you have One Day at a Time. This is a divorced mother raising two teenagers. She has friends that are male, and that's all they are, as friends, and they make that socially acceptable. Very, very different in that it really looked at what teenage girls go through and that relationship of mom to her teenage girls. So dating and puberty and all these things were questioned, all the way up through things like drug abuse. So a very, very new kind of television program. Mary Tyler Moore Show showed a single woman who did not want a man, did not want to have children. She wanted a career. So you have a great mixture here in the 1970s of what women wanted and did and what the norms were for them, individuals. Rhoda is a 30-something divorcee, so she's not a young woman. She's an older woman that's old enough to make up her mind. She does not have any children, and she actually was a spinoff of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. On that show, she was Rhoda was Mary's best friend, and when she gets a divorce, she gets her own show. So being divorced is becoming more and more socially acceptable in this time period, even when you're over the age of 30. Nowadays, the highest group getting a divorce, believe it or not, is 50-year-olds, but that was really unheard of in the 1970s. So to say that a 30-year-old can have a divorce and not have children, and she's probably not going to find a man in time to have children because she's 30 something, and this show made that okay. Then we have ones that made girls seem like heroes for the first time. So the Bionic Woman, Wonder Woman, Charlie's Angels. So women that were capable. I hate throwing Charlie's Angels in there. It is an example of women that could like solve cases and stuff, but they still were always in these sexy clothes and bouncing around, and it was all about how white their smile was. But at least they showed them as intelligent. At least some of the girls on it were intelligent. That's totally different than what it used to be. There are other topics too: racism, rape, poverty, war. All of that is part of television in the 1970s. So it's not just about women, it's about topics that prior to the 1970s were completely taboo in society. And, once you see it on TV, magically, it's okay to talk about. It's kind of like the internet for modern world. If you read it on the internet, it must be true. That's kind of how we looked at television in the 1970s. If it makes it to TV and they're saying it's okay, well, it must be okay. So we're allowed to talk about things that used to be socially disturbing. So the 1970s, my God, we were the ugliest dressed people on the planet, but lots and lots of changes, and I think changes for the better. Like here's reality. Yes, there were single working women that didn't want to be married. Yes, there were women with children that were widowed or divorced. So this is not television saying this is how it should be. It's saying this is how it is, and it was dead on. All right, so civil rights in the 1970s, we're not going to talk a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of movement in the 1970s. The big thing, the big name of the day is affirmative action. And basically this means that entities all over the United States, and I mean all over, like factories, stores, any place that you can get a job, all of a sudden you had to have a certain percentage of your workers being black, and later it will actually be women as well. So Johnson is the one that did this in the 60s, and it's challenged in the 70s, and it's sort of kind of upheld. So you have a percentage, and that percentage has to be black individuals. And society didn't really know what to do with that. If white society says too much about it, then that makes us look racist. And so do you say, hey, I was the man for the job, I just happened to be a white man, you shouldn't have given it to that black guy? How do you do that without being racist? So people actually just kind of didn't talk about it until this guy came along. But a guy by the name of Bach. Now, he had applied several times to get into college. I think it was medical school, if I remember correctly. But he was denied, and his grades were excellent. I mean, everything about this guy was, dead on, and he kept getting denied. And the reason he got denied is because he was white. And the school had a certain percentage of seats set aside for black students, and he just always ended up being, one of the white kids on the list that got booted in order to make the quota for black students. And so he takes it all the way to the Supreme Court and challenges it, and the quotas are done away in college. The quotas are done away, but they didn't take it completely away. Affirmative action is not completely killed. It will be later, but it's not completely killed yet. Under this court case, they said you can't set quotas in college anymore, but if we have two students that are exactly alike, their transcripts are exactly alike, everything about them is exactly alike except their color, we can give it to the black individual over the white individual. So Bach kind of won, kind of didn't win. But he is eventually allowed to go into the college and get his degree. All right, so let's get into the politics and Cold War of the 1970s. Woohoo! We can't talk about the 70s without talking about Nixon and Vietnam. So, you know that Vietnam had a pretty rough reputation already. By the 1970s, people were screaming for us to come home, and he will actually be the first president that starts that program of bringing our men home, and that's called Vietnamization. It began in 1969, and it was a very slow pullout. Basically, what it meant was American troops would stay in Vietnam long enough to train a Vietnamese troop to fight like them. And when they felt they were fully trained, the American troop came home and left the Vietnamese troop to fight their own battle. So it was going to be a slow process, yes, because that way you're not pulling everybody out overnight and causing chaos and allowing anybody who had been on America's side in this to be killed in their beds. Like, this has to be a slow process of withdrawal, and everybody is okay with that until we get word that Cambodia was harboring enemies of America and Vietnamese enemies of America. And instead of saying, okay, it's war, I get it, Cambodia is Vietnam's neighbor, of course there's going to be, some involvement with Cambodia. Richard Nixon really took this personally, and he gave orders to start the process of carpet bombing in Cambodia, who we were not at war with. So, carpet bombing basically leaves nothing untouched. And depending on where you were, you would be given a meal time off this operation menu, and it would tell you how many bombs and what kind of bombs to drop over your designated area. So breakfast was a pretty heavy drop. Supper was a really heavy drop. Snack, not so much. But in the end, it destroyed everything. And I hate it that we named it so flippantly after food, Operation Menu, because it cost a lot of people their lives. And so in my opinion, it was a very bad decision that we should have just gone in there and tried to capture the enemy instead of killing all the civilians that were killed through carpet bombing. But, Nixon got back at Cambodia for helping out the bad guy. So response to this carpet bombing in Cambodia is going to be pretty intense. It's going to increase the anti-war movement, specifically at a university called Kent State. So Kent State in 1970, we talked about this before, that kids, college kids, some of them were fighting against Vietnam only because they didn't want to go. So in this case, it's really hard to delineate between those who truly believe the war in Vietnam was wrong and those who just wanted it over to save themselves. But whatever is behind it, Kent State found out about the carpet bombing in Cambodia and went literally nuts. These kids went to they had like a gathering ground in the middle of Kent State, whenever they had something big like a concert or a gathering, they gathered there. And these kids all met in this gathering place at Kent State, and they got each other all riled up, like they're ready to rip the face off of President Nixon for what happened. And instead of staying there on at the school on campus, they decided to wander into town, and they start ransacking the town. So the governor closes the bars down. He says, look, this is bad enough. We don't need them going into the bars getting drunk and doing even more bad things. So close the bars down. So when they close the bars down, now more people are forced out into the street, and they take part in the Kent State uh, revolution, I guess you could say. They are revolting. And so what happens is that they end up burning down the ROTC building on campus. This gets even crazier. So the National Guard, of course, is called in, and they stone the Ohio National Guard. They trap them, these college kids, they trapped them and started stoning them. And so in response, of course, the National Guard, they were scared for their lives. They start firing into the crowd. 70 shots were counted. I don't know how they know it was exactly 70, but 70 shots were counted, and 4 people got killed and 9 people were wounded. And all of a sudden, these poor Ohio National Guard guys end up looking like monsters. They were being stoned. What did they think was going to happen when they start stoning men with guns in their hands? I mean, seriously. So the aftermath of it was that this so scared our political leaders that they closed every college across the entire United States for a period of time until we could get everything back together. But even the kids that weren't involved in this, even at other schools that weren't even Kent State, now all of a sudden their college is closed down and they can't finish out their classes. And so are they going to blame the kids at Kent State? No, they blame Nixon. So Nixon's reputation is headed down the toilet after Kent State. So Nixon, realizing that his reputation here at home is not doing wonderful, decides that he's got to do something kind of drastic. And so he begins to reach out to leaders that previously would not speak to the United States. And his goal is to create something called détente, or reducing tensions. Let's reduce tensions between our Cold War enemies. And so he visits Mao in China first and makes nice with Mao, comes up with solutions for the problem of starvation that Mao is still trying to take care of in China because of his own actions. That's a whole nother story. And actually, things go really well with Mao and Nixon. Nixon is invited to China to sit down with the leader and talk, and they definitely make nice. And so he did this on purpose, thinking that Mao was probably the more pliable of the two communist leaders between China and the Soviet Union. And so he picked Mao first. And then, of course, Brezhnev in the Soviet Union is never going to allow his neighbor communist to do something that he's not going to do. So Nixon is openly invited to come speak with him in Russia. So Nixon is very busy in the foreign realm, and in Russia, he begins SALT talks, which basically is going to limit strategic arms, or the production of strategic arms. This is a big deal. It is a very big deal. So China opened the door for, after a very long period of having it closed, and we got a Soviet leader to talk to us about reducing arms. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. So Nixon is starting to make a better name for himself. So, what started out for Nixon to be a good year is going to end up going kaput in 1973 because of the Middle East. So, this is going to be a little bit complicated, but there were some issues between Syria and Israel and Egypt. Okay, so the U.S. is loyal to Israel. No matter what Israel does or says, or what problem she has, or what trouble she starts, or whatever, we are loyal to Israel. Why? You should remember this. After World War II, we took all the Jews that were willing to go, and that was a lot of them, and we dropped them in Israel and said, we are now naming this Israel. It was Palestine prior to that. We're naming it Israel, and we're giving it to the Jews. We're going to call it the Jewish homeland. So we created Israel. We created it. It's our baby. And you know what? When your baby's bad, you still love it. When your baby does crazy things, you're still there standing by your baby's side. So we are always loyal to Israel. Well, Israel is having trouble with both Egypt and Syria. And so, of course, she thinks a war is coming. Golda Meir is the leader of Israel. She specifically thinks that there is a war coming. Her confidants tell her, no, this is crazy. Nothing's going to happen. But Golda Meir, being the leader of steel that she was, said, I think something's going to happen. And she contacted the United States and said, please come. And we went. And by golly, she was right. There was a war. It is now known as the Yom Kippur War. So it was Egypt and Syria, who are friends with the Soviet Union, versus Israel, who is friends with America. So really, remember, it's the Cold War. It's us fighting the Soviet Union. It's quick. It's over in less than 3 weeks. But we made big enemies of Egypt and Syria and Soviet Union as always. But Egypt and Syria have friends that we were getting oil from. So now we're this whole fiasco of us going in and helping Israel leads to an oil problem. And the group of countries that were selling oil to America and a lot of other countries, their conglomeration was known as OPEC. And OPEC responded to the loss of this Yom Kippur war with an embargo on oil. So all of a sudden, we couldn't get it, and our gas prices doubled. Now, you see here, they doubled to 55 cents. Oh my God, that's horrible. Back then, it was. It was a big deal that it doubled to 55 cents, and it did it overnight. So America went truly crazy over this. I love these pictures. So the way that they did it, first of all, they lowered the speed limit because that saves gas. But the way that they did it is according to your license plate. That the last few numbers of your license plate, or each state was different. It might be the first three numbers and letters of your license plate. Somehow you were thrown into a lottery thing, and on certain days of the week, based on your um, license plate, you got gas. So you might be a Tuesday gas person, and whatever you got on Tuesday, that had to last you until the next Tuesday. And there were guards so that nobody got crazy about it. They had a 10-gallon limit at many places. So if you filled your car up on a Tuesday and you only got 10 gallons, you were going to have to only use 10 gallons. So people went nuts. They were fighting each other in the streets. They were closing early because of gas shortages, which made people even more crazy. You see the picture at the top. They only sold gas 3 hours out of the day. So if you didn't make it through this line that you see in the 3 hours, sorry, but you weren't gonna get gas for another week. It was absolutely crazy. Now, I remember when I was a little girl, when we were on base, we went through the same thing. My dad was military, and so we did the same thing. And you, by golly, were not going to disobey the rules on base. No way. So we ended up, of course, because of the my mom's license plate, we ended up being in the gas line with the same people at the same time, week after week after week, and we got to be friends with them. And my sister and I would take like our Barbie dolls and stuff, and we would go from car to car to car and collect kids and play Barbie dolls or kickball or whatever. Like that was our fun day because we were going to spend hours there, and we looked forward to it. Of course, the parents aren't thinking that way at all, but to us it was fun. We had no idea what was going on, but stupid kids. Anyway, know that war that we allowed us ourselves to be sucked into with Israel led to this, and they did it under the name of Nixon. So Nixon is looking bad again. Poor Nixon, like a yo-yo, up and down. And then comes Watergate. So it's 1972. It's time to elect a new president. Nixon's term is over and he wants to run again. So supposedly, looking back in history now, he didn't say it at the time, but supposedly he was worried. He was worried that he was not going to get the vote. So the best thing for him to do would be to find out what the platform of the Democrats is going to be, and he could either beat them to the punch or figure out a way to make them look stupid for that platform, something. That would be, the best case scenario to somehow find that out. Supposedly, he brought together a committee to reelect the president known as CREEP, which is isn't it just creepy all unto itself? And supposedly he approved a break-in at the Watergate Hotel where the Democrats' headquarters was, and they were supposed to put bugs on the telephones and go through papers and take pictures of confidential stuff. This creep committee, and they got caught. So they immediately said Nixon knew about it. Nixon hired them to do it, and immediately America's like, what the heck is happening? What is happening? So is it true? Well, he already won the presidency by the time that this was uncovered. He had won the presidency, and he won by a landslide. So by the time that this really hits, the American ear, he's already won, and he won well. So it's really hard for Americans to believe that there was a committee that he put together to reelect the president, or that he okayed the idea of breaking into the office of the Democrats and stealing secrets. Why would he when he won by such a landslide? So he was a very paranoid character. So it could be that he really was worried for no reason whatsoever. But you got the OPEC thing, right? You got the Kent State thing. Is meeting with Mao and Russian leaders going to be enough to pull his reputation out of the mud and win in the 1972 election? So I don't know. I mean, you could fight for it either way. You could really fight for it either way. But There was a Justice Department investigation, of course, in 1973. So this is 71. It happened. He wins in 72, and the Justice Department gets a hold of it in 73 and begins an investigation. And they find out that Nixon fires the special prosecutor, A. Cox, when he tried to subpoena Oval Office tapes. Now, they do eventually get the tapes, but the tapes are garbled. Some of them are missing. So conversations are cut off in weird places. The tapes really are no good whatsoever when they finally get those subpoenaed tapes. But he is the president still, so he has the right to fire the special prosecutor Cox. Now, they investigated these guys that were discovered in the Watergate Hotel, and all of them had new money in their bank accounts. So the House, when they found that out, begins the impeachment process. They're going to remember impeachment starts in the House, so they begin it. And before they can make their final decision, Nixon will resign in 1974. So Vice President Ford will take his place, and he's going to have to deal with the mess that was left behind by Nixon. All right, so of course there is always collateral damage, and whether he did it or not, the impact of Watergate is what you see in front of you right here. For the first time, Americans began to distrust their government, especially the president. We'd never felt that way before. We might have hated Herbert Hoover and some other presidents before him, but we didn't believe that they would do evil, stinky stuff that would want us to remove them. I mean, we didn't see them as liars and cheats ever, even though some of them were. But all of a sudden, on a mass scale, Americans don't trust their own president. That is not a good legacy to have. And so Ford will serve out what was left of Nixon's term. So he's only going to be there from 74 to 76. And the day he walked in as president, this is what hit him: rising inflation and unemployment, the worst economy since the Great Depression. But there's just no way out of this. This country has gone through a lot of ups and downs in the late 60s and into the 70s, and we're just not doing well right now. Vietnam is up in the air. The minute that they found out that Nixon was resigning, what happens to Vietnamization? Watergate is going to make whoever follows Nixon kind of be the scapegoat. Nixon made it so that we're not trusting anybody, especially the vice president of the guy who just resigned. So we put Ford in a very, very bad situation. I don't think anybody would have done well in his shoes, but then he made a huge mistake, a political mistake. He pardoned Nixon. He pardoned him. So I don't know. I don't know why he thought that was the thing to do, but he did it, and it is definitely a nail in his presidential coffin. Now, in 1976, Ford is going to run again, and he's going to run against Jimmy Carter as a Democrat. Now, Ford thought that there was a chance for him to win because Carter was seen as an outsider. He had very, very little political experience. But like I said, Ford just was dropped into a situation where no matter what he did, it was not going to make the masses happy. And so even though Carter was seen as an outsider, rather than making that a bad thing, people said, well, you know what? He doesn't have a lot of political experience. Maybe that means he'll actually be good. He's not corrupt because he doesn't have political experience. And so guess what? Voila, Carter is going to win. And then he makes a huge mistake. He bit off way more than he could chew. He was too inexperienced. But the first thing that he did was to pardon Vietnam draft evaders. So anybody that went to Canada or wherever, to escape the draft, he made a blanket statement or a blanket pardon and pardoned them all. And here's our Vietnam vets coming home going, what? You did what? So, and people who had lost loved ones too, those guys got to go live in Canada for free, and now they can now and be free, and now they're going to come home and face no penalty. That angered a lot of people and did not do much for this man's reputation. So he's already having problems at home, but then he's going to get caught up in some foreign issues. Now, we already talked about Egypt and Israel hating each other. And between 48 and 74, they have four wars. And of course, every time we're going to side with Israel. But somehow, um, Carter convinces the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister to come to America in Maryland at Camp David and meet with each other after, all these years of hating one another. Maybe if I put them together in a house and we talk it out, then it'll work. So they both agree to it. I mean, surprisingly, they both agree to it. So they are there for 13 days. In the end, all three get Nobel Peace Prizes because they did have successful peace talks. They decided that they would lay down their hatred towards each other and look towards a better relationship. So it really did seem like a good situation. Now, I think that we don't give enough credit to Jimmy Carter for this. These two men absolutely hated each other. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin absolutely hated each other. And so they agreed to come, but they never agreed to sit in the same room with each other. So for most of these 13 days, these two men were at opposite ends of the house, and Jimmy Carter, ran from room to room delivering messages. He said this, well, he said that, he said this, and he said that. And so, literally, the president of the United States running from room to room to negotiate and soften the blows and get this done. And it took him 13 days, but he did. And I still do not think that that man gets enough credit for what he did. But it's not over. He's going to have more to deal with. Jimmy Carter still has to face a hostage crisis in Iran, an American hostage crisis. So, this is what happened. In the country of Iran, we had a Shah. His name is Mohammed, and he has this really long last name. So, we're just going to call him Shah Muhammad. He was the leader in Iran and had a pretty close relationship with the United States. We were actually friends with Iran at one time. Shocker, shocker. But the people that lived in Iran kind of got tired of this old regime. They wanted progress. They didn't think that they were modernized enough. They wanted change. And there was a man by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini, and sorry, it's Ayatollah Khomeini. And Ayatollah Khomeini gathered a rebel group together and overthrew the Shah and put in this very militaristic regime, wanted to throw off any American influence. They're Muslim, not that that matters, but a lot of them were radical Muslims, and so this hatred of America was the thing of the day in Iran. Now, they didn't kill Shah Muhammad, they let him go, and he ends up going to Egypt for a little while. He didn't feel well, so they put him in the hospital, and it came to light that he had cancer. And Egypt did not have the what he needed in order to help him get better. And so Carter was approached, could we bring the Shah to America for cancer treatment? And Carter said yes. Now, Shah Muhammad had always been friends with the United States. So he said yes. I totally get that. I totally get that. But the people in Iran are not going to get it, not under this new regime. So Iranians, a lot of them were students, seized the U.S. embassy in Tehran in 1979 and took 66 hostages. So they weren't, it was hard to determine what they were really going to do with the hostages. We saw them on TV like blindfolded. They always had the same clothes on, so it looked like they didn't get to have change of clothes very often. They didn't weren't allowed to speak. They were screamed at and yelled at a lot, but we didn't see a lot of violence. In fact, they allowed 13 women to leave, and then a man was having a health issue, like heart issue kind of thing, and so that man was allowed to leave. So they ended up with 52. So they had 52 hostages, and they will remain hostages. These United States citizens will remain hostages for 444 days. So you're talking a good chunk of Carter's presidency was him being bashed in the media because we had hostages, American hostages in Iran, and nothing was happening to get them back. So we'll talk more about how what happened with the release of those hostages in a little bit, but know that this was really that thing that Carter's reputation would never get over. These are some big deals. I mean, you're talking serious countries across the world, very powerful countries, and for whatever reason Jimmy Carter becomes the guy who is associated with all their issues. And I think it was just circumstances beyond his control. But anyway, 444 days, so they will be there for a very long time. And here's some of those pictures I talked about. So I mean, they look violent, like they're burning the flags, but they weren't getting on TV and cutting people's heads off like in the more recent kind of events. You didn't see them beating them or anything like that, like I said, but you see them with the blindfolds over their head. And I mean, nobody wants to see anybody like that, and they're American citizens. So these are the pictures that we saw all the time in the news. I mean, even after 444 days, nobody was forgetting that these people were over there, and the rebels in Iran are constantly showing pictures on the news about it. So it can't be forgotten. Now, Carter's response to the hostage crisis was a lot of people didn't think that it was severe enough. So he stops aid and commerce with Iran. They weren't trading with us anymore anyway. But to make the Iranian people angry, he froze all their assets in the United States banks, which did make them super, super angry. America was screaming, just go get our guys, go get our guys. So he did throw together a program called Operation Eagle Claw that was supposed to go and get these guys, and it failed absolutely miserably. The morning that they were supposed to take off, there was a sandstorm. They took off anyway, and one of the larger planes ran into a smaller plane, just crashed right into it, and killed all these 8 men that you see here. And so the program is completely aborted because of that. So Operation Eagle Claw never took off. So they are eventually going to be freed. It settled in 1980 because Iran needed funds to fight Iraq. And so they're going to have to ask us for some money. So they do decide that they will go ahead and free the hostages after 444 days. It just so happens that the day that they announced that we are releasing the hostages was also the day that Reagan was inaugurated. So guess who gets credit for the release of the hostages? Ronald Reagan. He's not even the president yet, and he gets all the credit for it. So this did absolutely cripple Carter's presidency, and he was looked on as a bad president. Everything that happened at Camp David was forgotten, and Carter was he kind of goes down in history as being an idiot. So I just think that's so odd that it just happened to be the day that Reagan was inaugurated. Because Reagan, you'll find out, gets credit for a whole lot of things he never did. He was a good president, but I think the fates are with this guy because it just happens on his day, his inauguration day, that they are released, and he gets credit for it. But don't forget, he did nothing. He did nothing. He had nothing to do with it. All right, so now we are getting into the 1980s. Woohoo! 1980s, big hair and leggings. Let's go. So, the women of the 80s, once again, you are going to come up with what it was like to be a woman in the 80s. So, all these topics here, you're going to tell me about. But let's look at some of the achievements. So we do have court upheld complaints of sexual harassment in the workplace. Prior to this, you didn't talk about harassment in the workplace, and men could pat your fanny and say inappropriate things, and women didn't talk about it because the men were the boss. But women are going to start complaining, and it's going to be upheld when things are taken to court. We also have women that are making great strides in whole new realms. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice in 1981. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space in 1983. So wonderful, wonderful women. Sandra Day O'Connor is going to be on the court for a long time too, and she does amazing things. So it's the election of 1980, and who's going to be running? Jimmy tries again. Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan. Ain't going to happen. Sorry, Carter. Ronald Reagan ran on the platform, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And of course, the United States stood up and said, no, we're not. And they voted for Ronald Reagan. So Carter is out. One administration, that's all he gets. So, under Ronald Reagan, we definitely do see a revolution of the United States. There is a giant rise in conservatism. He is a very religious man, and you see here terms like religious right and the moral majority. He brings prayer back into schools. He's not afraid to say he's Christian, and he says it often. He's also, though, on the other hand, tough on unions. So, a great example is the air traffic control strike that happened, I believe it was in 1981. These were federal employees that went on strike. They wanted less hours, better pay, yada, yada, the things they always want when they go on strike. And he said adamantly, you have 48 hours to return to work. You are federal employees. You're not allowed to strike. So either you return to work in 48 hours or you lose your job and you will be blackballed from any job that has anything to do with the government for the rest of your life. And maybe your children will be blackballed. So he was not kidding. And they all went back to work within 48 hours. Absolutely. He did have an ideology of reduction in entitlements. So basically, you're going to have to prove to the government that you need financial support before they'll give it to you. So there are hoops that you're going to have to jump through. You can't just say, I'm a single mom with 10 kids, I need money. You have to prove yourself to get those entitlements. We need to go back to that for sure. He did do tax cuts, but he did tax cuts more for the rich than the poor. He believed in trickle down. And if you remember, Alexander Hamilton believed this too, that if you make the rich richer, they will hire more poor, and now the poor won't be poor. And that never works. Never, 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 never does it work. It's called Keynesianism, sorry, under Ronald Reagan. But whatever you call it, trickle down does not work. So, at the time, everybody thought he was fantastic because he was cutting taxes on the rich business guys. But, as things progressed and the economy started to tank, we went back and said, oh, this is where it started. And a lot of it did start with his tax cuts. So later, after he's not the president anymore, that we'll see some backlash from this. But at the time, everybody thinks it's great. He's very socially conservative, talks about religion a lot, and says government's the problem, not the solution. We need to clean up our act. He starts going through different departments in our government and reducing expenditures. The only thing that he's not going to reduce spending on is, can you guess? Can you guess? He's actually going to build it up. That's right, defense. So $1.2 trillion are approved to go to the defense of our country. Can't say I disagree with that. So Reagan is definitely going to be a hero from day one because of the Iran hostage crisis. Boy, I cannot talk today. But he's going to be even a bigger hero when he beats a communist in Grenada. Grenada. However you want to say it. Tomato, tomato. 1983. So let's find out how he does this. Now, in Grenada, 1983, it's November 25th through the 29th is when it heats up. But in Grenada, there's about 1,000 American, mostly medical students that are down there studying for their degrees. And a communist by the name of Bernard Coard decides he doesn't like Grenada's leader and has him assassinated, and he takes control of the government. So there's protesting in the streets on both sides, some people for Coard, some people against him, and we end up really worrying about this 1,000 American medical students because if they realize they're American, bad things might happen to them. So Reagan does not miss a heartbeat. He sends in 6,000 troops and immediately goes after Coard, takes him down, and replaces him with what we deem to be an acceptable government. So in 4 days, man, in 4 days. So Reagan administration, of course, announces to the world that this is the first rollback of communism since the start of the Cold War, and he looks like a flippin' hero to us. Not everybody approved. Some people said, Grenada's leader was not a good man, and Bernard Coard did a good thing for Grenada. So some people said it wasn't really Americans' business over just 1,000 students, and Reagan was actually a bully. Even Margaret Thatcher, who loved Ronald Reagan and was his big buddy, even in private, she said that he was a bully. So there was worldwide heat about what happened in Grenada. Not a lot of Americans thought that we did anything wrong there, but there was worldwide heat. So remember that. And here's some pictures of communism starts here. Pictures from it actually happening. Thank God for the U.S. Da 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 da. Thank you, U.S., for liberating us. So these are the pictures that were being shown in American media. That people were thankful that we had gone down and saved them. Not just American students, but everybody. And then we get a scandal. He's not going to get out of the presidency clean. Come on. So the scandal falls under the name of the Iran Contra affair, and it took place from 1985 to 1987. And this is going to get a little bit complicated. So stop when you need to and take really good notes. All right, so Reagan administration wanted to arm the rebel Contras in Nicaragua. Okay, so the rebels are called Contras. They were fighting their communist government. It's the Cold War. So Reagan says, hey, if they want to fight their own government and destroy their own communist government, shouldn't we help them? So Reagan wants to arm these people. Congress said, no, the world is mad at us over Grenada or Grenada or however you want to say it. So they absolutely said no. So the president is going, he needs money to help them, and he's going to find a way to get it. And that's where we come into the scandal. Okay. Now we're leaving over there for right now. Okay, we're got to go to a different part of the world to finish the story. I told you this was going to be very, very complicated. Reagan needs money to help the Contras. Okay, at the exact same time that all this is going on across the world, 39 Americans are going to be held hostage in Lebanon because Israel was holding 700 Shiite hostages. And remember, Israel is our child. Okay, I'm sure you're sitting there going, I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, all you need to know right this minute is that Reagan needed money to help the Contras. Okay, so let's set that story aside for a minute. On top of everything else that's happening, 39 Americans are being held hostage in Lebanon because Israel was holding some of their Shiite people. Okay? Okay, let's move on. All right, now remember, Lebanon is holding our people hostage, okay? Iran needs weapons to fight Iraq, and they are a very close friend to Lebanon. Iran is a friend to Lebanon. So maybe if we give weapons to Iran, they will strike a deal to release the hostages if America is willing to sell them some weapons. We're not going to give them to them, we're going to sell them. So, Iran, we will sell you weapons to fight Iraq, but in order for us to do it at this low everyday price, you have to make sure that Lebanon lets go of our people. I hope this makes sense. All right, so it became known as like the Arms for Hostages plan. And the Reagan administration did it secretly. So they sold arms to Iran, sold them to Iran. Even after the hostages were released, they still sold weapons to Iran. So Lebanon did as they were asked by their friend Iran, and they were released, and we still were selling weapons to Iran, and we did it secretly. But here's the thing. Don't forget, the Contras need money in Nicaragua. So whatever money Reagan made from the sale of weapons to Iran, he gave that money to the Contras. So he wasn't putting money in his own pocket. He wasn't putting money anywhere in America. He was sending it directly to the Contras. But the reality of it is Congress had said, no, you can't do this. We were secretly selling weapons to an enemy country, Iran, so that they could fight another enemy of ours, Iraq. So the whole thing is just crazy, crazy, crazy. So Iran Contra, that's how we get Iran and Nicaragua associated, because we sold weapons to Iran to give money to the Contras. Whew, that was hard to explain. All right, so here we go. We're going to try and make it look like a triangle. There we go, okay? So America is getting money from Iran for selling them weapons, and then the money is going from America to Nicaragua, right? Right, okay. So, of course, you can't keep something that big a secret, and it's going to be exposed in 1986, and an entire giant list of people are going to be put on trial. Here's some of the illegal actions that they were put on trial for. Number one, America does not negotiate with terrorists, ever. And Iran is a terrorist nation, and we were selling guns to them. So, no, 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 no. Congress had also outlawed help for Iraq to beat Iran. So it stands to reason that we can't help Iran win over Iraq. So I wish they would change the names of those countries. It would make our history classes so much easier. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. Also, Congress outlawed that financial help for the Contras, like we talked about. So it supposedly we gave them $70 million. And these guys were terrorists in their own right too. I mean, they were beating and torturing civilians. That's terrorism. So we gave them maybe as much as $70 million. There were 29 people investigated. Only 14 went to trial. 9 were pardoned or dismissed, and the last 5 were pardoned by Bush seniors. So, to be honest with you, nothing really happened to anybody as far as massive jail time. It was kind of swept under the carpet, to be honest. Now, there was one man who his life was changed forever, and his name was Oliver North. So he was the head of the National Security Council, and he was the one that got the money from Iran and gave it to the Contras. And so he was highly looked at. Ollie will be dismissed in 1991. He does not do any jail time, and he never ever gave Reagan up. He never spoke ill of him. He never specifically said Ronald Reagan made me do this or told me to do that. Not ever, 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 ever. Americans actually loved this man. I mean, there were a lot of people that were hoping that he was going to run for president. He handled himself with such tact and such honor and showed such respect for the president whenever he was up on the stand. He really, really was well loved. So you see on Time Magazine, he says, I was authorized to do everything that I did, but he never, ever, ever says Reagan. Never. So to me, that is pretty brave. Now, what about Reagan? Was he involved? When Reagan was asked about it, he claimed that he didn't remember. He didn't remember giving orders for this or for that, and it definitely weakened him for his second term, absolutely. So here is a little quote of his. A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts of the evidence tell me it is not. He's saying he doesn't remember. As the Tower Board reported, what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages. So he's basically saying he was not aware of how this evolved. Yeah, I'm not so sure I believe that. You decide for yourself. All right, but then he's going to make a great comeback, not because of anything he did, but because the Soviet Union is going to have to give up on their military buildup. They can't afford it anymore. And so they are going to have to make some massive reforms, and that is done under the leadership of Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. Now, his two major forms of reform is glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means that you are allowed to openly criticize your government. He was hoping that people would like criticize and give him some way of making things better for the Soviet Union. Like he needed people to tell him, what can I do? What can I do to make it better? And of course, people were terrified. They weren't going to say anything. This is a Soviet nation. It's Stalin's Soviet nation. They're not going to speak out against the leader, so it didn't work. Perestroika was a restructuring of the economy, so it didn't look like pure communism anymore. Some people were allowed to make a surplus, kind of like Lenin had done. Allow the farmers to make money off of their surplus, so they'll want surplus. They'll grow more food. That didn't work either. People said, "Hey, this isn't communism anymore," and so they constantly went against Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev and Reagan were pretty good buddies. They met often. They drank together often. And that was Reagan's policy. Let's talk man to man. That was his foreign policy. He did it with everybody. But he met with Gorbachev quite a bit. Now, in this relationship that they developed, there was a time that they were having a couple drinks with one another, and this was, I believe, it was 1980. I want to say 87. Um, I could be off a little bit, but anyway, he met these two met, and they had a little bit too much to drink. And Gorbachev says to Reagan, "Hey, um, don't say anything to anybody, but I'm pretty sure that we're gonna have to take the wall down. Like it's gonna come down. I'm not ready for it yet. We're gonna have to decide what kind of process we're gonna use. How it can't be done quickly. That'll be chaotic. So." the wall's going to have to come down. So I just want to assure you that communism is probably on its way out. But you can't tell anybody. You can't tell anybody. You can't tell anybody. So Reagan promises not to tell anybody. So Ronald Reagan in 1987 goes to the Brandenburg Gate. So it was 85 when the two of them had that secret little talk. So this is 2 years later. He's invited to the Brandenburg Gate to make a speech. And in that speech, you've heard it before. What does he say? Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I know it sounded just like Reagan, didn't it? Yeah, I know you're so impressed. So the wall comes down, and who ends up getting the credit for it? Even though it's 2 years after Reagan said that, it had nothing to do with Reagan. Reagan gets all the credit for it. It wasn't him, it was Gorbachev. It was Gorbachev, it was Gorbachev. And he really stabbed Gorbachev in the back with this tear down the wall speech in 1987. But he knew, and this is Ronald Reagan being the leader that he knew that America needed something to make us feel good about ourselves again. We needed something to make the world have faith in us again. After all the scandals that had happened in the last few decades, we needed this. And by golly, it worked. If you ask most people who's responsible for the wall coming down, they will tell you Ronald Reagan. Even people in Berlin will tell you that. And of course, it had absolutely nothing to do with him. So it does start independence movements across many countries. Communist satellite nations are going to start to fall out of communism one after another, and 11 of them will obtain their freedom from the communist rule. Gorbachev is going to resign in 1991. So in 1991, he signs off basically that the Cold War is over. So the wall came down in 89, and a lot of people say that's officially the end of the Cold War. But in reality, on paper, it's not truly over until 1991 when Gorbachev resigns. And he resigned he was bullied. He was definitely bullied into it. That just nothing he did resonated well with his people. And so Gorbachev is the last leader of the Soviet Union. They will go back to being called Russia. All right, so Boris Yeltsin is in charge, and he decides that he's going to change flags. So you see the old anvil and sickle over there, and now we have a new flag under Boris Yeltsin. All right, so the US becomes a sole superpower because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. There can't be a Cold War. We are the superpower. And so the 1980s, early 90s becomes like our grand time on stage. We are at our highest level of all across the world. So Boris Yeltsin he also had a very good relationship with the United States. You see him here with Clinton, and you see him here with Bush. In Russia, his reforms were referred to as economic genocide, however. So he resigned in 1991. And do you know who took his place? Or 1999, sorry. Do you know who took his place? You should know Vladimir Putin. And Putin has been in control ever since. All right, so that is it for the 1980s. And we're going to fly through the rest of it too. So hope you understand. If you need more help with Iran Contra, I don't know, read a book. I'm just kidding. You can call me.